Do you seriously believe your pedestrian understanding of the law entitles you to speak in my lecture hall? Professor Arthur Vance sneered, his hands resting casually on the edge of the polished mahogany podium. Sit down, Miss Caldwell, right now. Maya Caldwell didn't raise her voice. She didn't panic, nor did she shrink under the crushing weight of the university's most feared academic. She simply looked at the older, smirking professor through her wire-rimmed glasses with a quiet, piercing intensity that absolutely should have warned him. Professor, I highly recommend you double-check the foundational precedents of your argument before you do something you will profoundly regret. He just laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound that echoed in the heavy silence of the cavernous room. He had no idea he had just targeted the wrong student. The suffocating pressure of elite academia hung heavy over the sprawling, affluent campus of the prestigious law school. The autumn sunlight filtered through the grand, stained-glass windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the sterile air, creating a theatrical spotlight where Maya stood relaxed behind her tiered desk. She was a young woman who commanded respect in every room she entered without ever having to demand it. At 24, her sharp, intelligent eyes missed nothing. She wore a simple, expertly tailored charcoal blazer over a crisp white silk blouse, the uniform of a woman accustomed to navigating high-stakes legal environments, not enduring public humiliation from an insecure academic. At the front of the hall, Professor Vance strutted with a slow, exaggerated swagger that suggested he believed he owned the very institution he worked for. He was a man in his late 50s, with silver hair and a tailored suit that looked a little too expensive for a standard teaching salary, emphasizing his external consulting wealth. His fragile authority was built entirely on a foundation of deep-seated prejudice and the impenetrable shield of academic tenure. His eyes, narrowed with unearned arrogance, swept aggressively over Maya. His body language screamed absolute dominance. He stopped pacing, tactically positioning himself at the center of the stage to loom over the amphitheater-style seating. "Your continued presence in this program is a privilege, Miss Caldwell," he demanded, his tone flat, unyielding, and completely devoid of standard professional courtesy. "Not a right, and I can have it revoked with a single signature. Sit down or get out." "Your continued presence in this program is a privilege, Miss Caldwell," he demanded, his tone flat, unyielding, and completely devoid of standard professional courtesy. "Not a right, and I can have it revoked with a single signature. Sit down or get out." Maya didn't look down at the heavy, leather-bound textbook on her desk. She stood up, brushing a microscopic piece of lint off her slacks, and looked directly, unblinkingly, into Professor Vance's eyes. "I will see you before the disciplinary board, Professor Vance." "I look forward to it. Bring your academic advisor," he sneered, turning his back on her and strutting back toward his lectern. "Have a nice day now." Maya's legs were stiff from standing under the intense scrutiny of 100 silent classmates, but her mind was racing with razor-sharp clarity. She walked smoothly to the back of the hall, ignoring the whispers erupting around her, and calmly pulled out her smartphone. She opened the voice memo application and saved the crisp, high-resolution audio recording of the entire lecture. She made sure the time, GPS location, and date stamp were visibly enabled on the file. She then stepped out into the cool embrace of the university corridor. Professor Vance thought he had won the encounter. He didn't realize the real battle was just beginning. 3 weeks later, the sprawling university administration building bustled with its usual chaotic, nervous energy. Anxious students in sharp, uncomfortable suits hurried past administrative assistants clutching crumpled paperwork. The stale air was thick with the low murmur of rapid-fire academic jargon, the squeak of polished shoes on linoleum, and nervous chatter. Professor Arthur Vance strode through the main entrance with his familiar, swaggering gait, bypassing the long student lines. Disciplinary hearings were usually a breeze for him, an easy morning of asserting his dominance. Students showed up, apologized profusely to avoid a mark on their record, accepted their academic probation, or mumbled a weak excuse that the board quickly dismissed. The system ruled in his favor 99% of the time. He paused to check the printed docket posted on the bulletin board outside the heavy wooden doors of Conference Room 4B, University Ethics Committee versus Maya Caldwell. A smirk touched his lips. He remembered her perfectly, the arrogant, icy student with the fancy, tailored blazer who thought her intelligence made her better than him. He was genuinely looking forward to putting her in her place again, this time with the full weight of the university backing him up. Vance pushed through the swinging doors and took his usual seat on the side reserved for faculty, a section specifically positioned to look down upon the student's podium. He adjusted his silk tie, leaned back, and exchanged a quiet joke with a fellow department head about the misery of handling student complaints. When the committee chair finally called the case 20 minutes later, Vance stood up promptly and walked to the faculty table, a confident, easy smile plastered on his face. He expected to see Maya Caldwell standing alone at the podium, perhaps looking intimidated by the imposing wood-paneled room, the high ceilings, and the inherent majesty of the academic disciplinary system. Instead, she was seated calmly at the defense table, and she was not alone. The presiding judge, a stern-looking, no-nonsense woman named Honorable Judge Reynolds, entered the boardroom through a heavy side door. "All rise," the university administrative clerk intoned loudly. Judge Reynolds took her seat at the head of the polished conference table, adjusted her reading glasses, and shuffled the thick stack of disciplinary files before her. Next on the docket, case number 24-ETH-8894, University Ethics Committee versus Maya Caldwell. Citation for disruptive conduct, insubordination, and failure to comply with academic instructions. How does the student respond? The distinguished man seated beside Maya stood up, buttoning his tailored suit jacket with a fluid, practiced motion. "Not guilty, Madam Chair. Furthermore, the defense is filing an immediate motion to dismiss this case with prejudice based on a total lack of substantive grounds, verbal harassment by the faculty member, and the presentation of a fabricated narrative by the presiding professor." Vance nearly laughed out loud, though he managed to stifle it into a quiet, arrogant scoff. A fabricated narrative for a simple student conduct warning? This girl had completely lost her mind. She was treating this like a federal trial. The university's legal representative, a young, slightly disheveled assistant counsel who looked severely overworked and desperately in need of coffee, glanced nervously at the defense attorney. "Madam Chair, the university objects to the motion. We are prepared to proceed with the hearing. Professor Vance is present and ready to provide his statement." "Very well," Judge Reynolds said, looking intrigued despite her usual stoic demeanor. "Let's hear the testimony. Call your witness, counselor." Vance took his seat at the witness microphone, swore the standard oath to tell the truth, and settled comfortably into the high-backed leather chair. He felt entirely at ease. This was his turf. The boardroom was merely an extension of his lecture hall. The young university counsel stood up to begin the direct examination. "Professor Vance, can you please describe for the committee the events of the afternoon of October 12th regarding your interaction with the student, Miss Caldwell?" Vance launched into his smooth, rehearsed narrative, a script he had recited 100 times before when crushing student dissent. He spoke in clipped, professional tones about observing the dangerously disruptive behavior, initiating a standard classroom management protocol for the benefit of the other students, and Miss Caldwell's immediate hostile, argumentative demeanor. He conveniently, expertly omitted his derogatory comments about her understanding of the law, his aggressive physical intimidation, and the prolonged, humiliating public dressing down. He focused solely on the alleged insubordination. The silence in the conference room was absolute, a heavy, suffocating pressure that seemed to emanate from the committee members themselves. Judge Reynolds stared at the device, her gaze shifting slowly to Vance, who looked as if he had been struck physically. The recording had done its work. The mask of the composed, authoritative educator was shattered. "Professor Vance," Marcus began, his voice calm, cutting through the thick air. This recording was made inside the classroom. It clearly shows your conduct, your aggressive intimidation, and your attempt to stifle academic inquiry with personal attacks. How does this align with your earlier sworn statement that you were merely maintaining order? Vance wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, his composure finally dissolving. That recording, it's a snippet. It's out of context. Miss Caldwell was being difficult. She was questioning my syllabus, undermining my authority in front of the entire student body. I had to exert control. Exert control? Marcus repeated, his lip curling slightly. Your Honor, I present Exhibit C, the professor's official disciplinary report filed against my client. In it, he alleges that Miss Caldwell physically blocked his path to the podium and refused to leave the room for 10 minutes. Yet, in the recording you have just heard, there is not a single sound of struggle, nor is there any demand for her to leave the room. Instead, we hear a professor demanding silence to cover his own insecurity. Judge Reynolds took the document from the clerk, her eyes scanning the lines with meticulous precision. She peered over the rim of her glasses at Vance. Professor Vance, are you stating for the record that the incident occurred exactly as written in this report? Because the timeline described here, the 10 minutes of obstruction, is not reflected in the time-stamped audio recording we have just heard. Vance's breathing became shallow. He looked toward the university council, pleading for an objection, a distraction, anything. But the young lawyer remained staring at the table, his knuckles white. The tide had turned. The power he had wielded so casually had evaporated, leaving him exposed and vulnerable in the very institution where he had once stood as a titan. It might have been an estimation, Vance stammered, his voice losing its resonance. Time perceptions they can be subjective in high-stress situations. Subjective, Marcus echoed, the word dripping with disdain. Is that what you call a sworn document used to threaten a student's academic future? A subjective estimation? The tension in the room was electric. The committee members began whispering among themselves, their faces grim. The fabrication was no longer an accusation. It was becoming a proven reality. Professor, you stated in your formal submission that Miss Caldwell physically blocked your path to the podium for 10 minutes, preventing you from conducting the lecture. This recording is only 3 minutes long, and the audio clearly indicates you were shouting at her from the podium the entire time. Where exactly did those missing 7 minutes of your 10-minute confrontation occur? Vance felt the floor beneath him shift. The cool, controlled environment of the university seemed to turn hostile. The timeline might be compressed. Adrenaline does strange things to one's perception of time. It was a high-stress situation. High stress for you or for the student you were berating? Marcus interjected, his voice rising in controlled volume. He didn't wait for an answer, already pacing toward the jury of faculty members. Your Honor, we have here a clear pattern of behavior. Professor Vance has weaponized his authority to systematically target students who represent a challenge to his outdated worldview. Judge Reynolds signaled for silence, her eyes narrowing behind her spectacles as she turned her gaze toward the professor. Professor Vance, this committee values academic integrity above all else. If your testimony is found to be intentionally misleading, or if it is proven that you have fabricated reports against students, the consequences will be severe. Are you certain of the timeline provided in your written statement? Vance looked around the room, desperately hoping for a nod of support from his colleagues, but they were already leaning away from him, their faces becoming impassive masks. He had become a pariah in a matter of minutes. He realized then that the tenure he had relied on for decades was not a suit of armor. It was a target on his back. It was an estimation, Vance stammered, his voice losing its resonance. I stand by my characterization of the event, regardless of the precise duration. Marcus didn't let him breathe. He pulled a thick bundle of documents from his table, dropping them onto the wooden surface with a thud that seemed to vibrate through the entire room. Your Honor, I present Exhibit D, a compiled list of 15 students who have been subject to similar disciplinary actions from Professor Vance over the last 5 years. Every single one of them shares a common trait. They were all scholarship students from underrepresented backgrounds, much like Miss Caldwell. Is it merely a coincidence that their academic progress was repeatedly stalled by the same man, under the same vague charges of disruptive conduct? The room erupted in a low, collective murmur of shock. Students in the gallery leaned forward, their eyes wide. Vance felt his face flush with a heat that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. He was no longer the accuser. He was the one on trial, and the evidence was mounting far faster than he could dismantle it. He was drowning in his own hubris, and for the first time in his career, he saw no life raft in sight. Judge Reynolds leaned forward, her expression hardening into a mask of pure, unadulterated scrutiny. "Professor Vance," she said, her voice low and dangerous, vibrating through the small, tense boardroom. 15 students, all from similar backgrounds, all struggling with conduct issues. This isn't classroom management, it's a statistical anomaly that strongly suggests a systemic problem with your methodology. Vance's collar felt like a tightening noose. He tried to stand to regain his stature, but his knees wobbled, betraying his sudden, overwhelming fear. Those students were simply underprepared. They couldn't handle the rigor of my curriculum. My duty as an educator is to maintain the standards of this institution. If they fall behind, that is on them, not me. Marcus didn't miss a beat. "Standards? Let's talk about standards, Professor." He turned to the committee chair. "Madam Chair, I would like to submit Exhibit E, a series of emails between Professor Vance and the Dean of the Law Department regarding these very students. You will notice a recurring theme. In every single instance, Professor Vance recommended their dismissal immediately following their submission of term papers that directly challenged his own recent research findings on constitutional law. The room went stiller than a graveyard. Vance's face went sheet white, the blood retreating entirely from his features. The emails were the smoking gun. It wasn't about classroom disruption. It was about intellectual censorship. He was punishing students for being smarter than him, for finding holes in his life's work. "This is an outrage," Vance shouted, his voice cracking, the polished academic facade completely crumbling under the pressure. "These are private correspondences. You have no right to present these to this committee." "I have every right," Marcus countered, his voice steady, cold, and utterly unforgiving. "When they prove that you have been engaging in the systematic sabotage of your students' careers to protect your own fragile and apparently flawed reputation." Judge Reynolds slowly picked up the bundle of printed emails. She didn't look at Vance. She looked at the committee members and then at Maya, who sat unmoved, a picture of quiet, unshakable strength. The professor's career wasn't just on the line. It was being dismantled piece by piece under the weight of his own arrogance. Judge Reynolds peered down from the bench, her gaze dissecting Vance with surgical precision. "Professor, I am less concerned with your perception of stress and far more interested in these emails. You explicitly referred to Miss Caldwell as an intellectual liability due to her background in your correspondence with the dean. Would you care to explain what an intellectual liability is in your own words?" Vance's hands trembled against the mahogany table. He had built his life on the idea that he was the gatekeeper of genius, that he alone decided who was worthy of the halls of justice. To see that worldview dissected, analyzed, and held up for ridicule by someone as young as Maya was a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. "I meant," Vance began, his voice barely a whisper, "that she lacked the foundational rigor required for the advanced nature of my research." "Rigor?" Marcus stepped forward, his voice a smooth, dangerous contrast to the professor's stuttering. "Or perhaps you meant she was capable of independent thought, because according to your own private emails, You were quite comfortable with students who accepted your theories without question. It was only when Miss Caldwell challenged your methodology, correctly as it happens, that she became a liability. The committee chair tapped a pen against her notebook. Professor, the university's code of conduct explicitly prohibits discrimination based on protected characteristics. These emails, should they be authenticated, would not only lead to your immediate suspension, but would invite significant legal repercussions for this department. The word legal hung in the air, heavy and sharp. For a man who had spent his life lecturing on the sanctity of the law, the irony was thick enough to choke on. Vance looked across the table. Maya was watching him. She wasn't smiling, but there was a quiet, unyielding power in her expression that terrified him more than any gavel. He had thought her silence was submission. He now understood it was calculation. "This is a witch hunt," Vance finally erupted, slamming his hand onto the table, though the gesture lacked any real threat. It was the desperate thrashing of a man watching his empire burn. "I have published in the most prestigious journals in the country. I have shaped the careers of judges, senators, and partners. You cannot destroy me over a petty dispute with a student." "It isn't a petty dispute, Professor," Judge Reynolds said, her voice freezing the room. "It is a matter of ethics, and you have failed the most fundamental test of our profession." "Professor Vance," Marcus began, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low hum. "If your standards are so universally high, why is it that in the last 3 years, the only students you have failed are those who published articles questioning your specific theories on constitutional limits? Is it possible that your standards are nothing more than a mechanism to silence intellectual opposition?" Vance's hands were visibly shaking now. He gripped the edge of the witness stand, his knuckles white, attempting to regain the composure that had served him for decades. I expect excellence. I expect students to respect the established hierarchy of legal thought. They weren't prepared for the level of discourse I demand." "Hierarchy," Marcus repeated, the word hanging in the air like a sharp accusation. "Is that what you call it? Or is it simply a cult of personality you've built to insulate yourself from legitimate academic critique? We have testimonies from 3 different former students who claim you told them, in private, that their careers would be over if they didn't pull their submissions from the law review." Judge Reynolds leaned forward, her spectacles glinting under the harsh overhead fluorescent lights. "Professor Vance, this is not an academic debate. This is a disciplinary hearing. We are discussing the potential misuse of institutional power. You will answer the counselor's question directly." Vance looked left, then right, searching for an ally, a way out, but found only the cold, judgmental faces of his peers. He had spent years ensuring no one could challenge him, but in doing so, he had created a vacuum of loyalty. There was no one left to defend him. He started. He faltered. His arrogance, the very foundation of his identity, had been stripped away, layer by layer. He looked at Maya again. She wasn't just sitting there. She was documenting everything, her pen moving with a calm, methodical rhythm that seemed to tick away the seconds of his tenure. "The emails, Professor," Marcus pressed, holding up the printed documents as if they were a weapon. "They aren't just opinions, they are admissions. They outline a clear pattern of targeted harassment, explicitly detailing your intent to prevent these students from graduating. Are you going to deny that you wrote these, or are you going to force the committee to subpoena the university's server logs to prove it?" The room felt like it was closing in. The silence was heavy, expectant, and cruel. Vance realized he was no longer the protagonist of this story. He was the villain, and the hero was the girl he had dismissed as a pedestrian mind. The walls of his ego were finally collapsing. Judge Reynolds signaled for the committee to cease their deliberations. The silence that followed was heavy, a physical weight pressing down on the table. Vance sat frozen, his hands clasped so tightly they were devoid of color. He looked like a man who had suddenly realized the ground beneath his feet was no longer solid earth, but thin ice. "Professor Vance, the judge began, her voice steady and echoing throughout the room. The committee has reviewed the audio evidence, the corroborating testimony, and the digital record of your communications. Your defense, that this was a matter of classroom management, has been systematically dismantled by the evidence of targeted bias. To categorize a student as an intellectual liability simply for challenging your research is a direct violation of this university's code of ethics. Vance tried to speak, his lips dry and trembling. This is biased. You are judging 20 years of service on a single, manipulated recording. We are judging 20 years of service against the fundamental principles of the institution you claim to represent. Reynolds cut him off, her tone devoid of sympathy. The committee's recommendation to the Board of Regents is immediate suspension without pay, pending a full investigation for termination. Furthermore, your tenure is officially under review. You are to remove your personal effects from the faculty office by the end of the business day. The words landed like lead weights. Vance looked around, but there was no protest, no defense, no championing by his colleagues. They were as silent as the grave. He had spent decades ensuring his own invincibility, never considering the cost of the bridges he burned along the way. Maya sat quietly, her expression unreadable. She didn't cheer, she didn't smile. She simply closed her folio, the sound of the snap echoing through the room. It wasn't just a victory for her. It was the quiet, necessary correction of a system that had become infested with ego. As Vance pushed his chair back, his movements jerky, uncoordinated, and utterly defeated, he didn't look at his peers. He looked at Maya, perhaps for the first time truly seeing her not as a liability, but as a peer. But the time for recognition had passed. He walked out of the room, his legacy trailing behind him in the dust of the hallway he had once marched through with such misplaced confidence. The committee turned their attention back to the files, but for Maya, the weight she had been carrying, the exhaustion of having to prove her worth to a man who refused to see it, was finally lifting. The air in the room grew heavy, the silence stretching until it felt physical. Judge Reynolds studied the printed emails with a cold, detached intensity that made Vance's hands tremble. The committee members passed the documents among themselves, their expressions shifting from polite interest to grim realization. It wasn't just a dispute over a grade anymore. It was a clear-cut case of intellectual sabotage and systemic bias. Professor Vance, Judge Reynolds began, her voice steady and echoing against the wood-paneled walls. These documents detail a pattern that goes beyond mere classroom management. You have systematically targeted students who did not conform to your personal biases. In this email dated March 14th, you describe a student's research on constitutional law as an insult to the legal profession before initiating a disciplinary review that ultimately prevented them from graduating on time. How do you justify this? Vance's confidence had long since evaporated. He shifted in his chair, his eyes darting toward the door as if searching for an exit. Those were private thoughts, shared in confidence with the dean. I was protecting the reputation of the department. I have a duty to ensure that only those who truly understand the depth of our legal tradition advance to the bar. If that requires filtering, then that is what I did. Filtering? Marcus stepped forward, his voice a smooth, dangerous calm. Is that what you call it when you bury a student's potential because their background makes you uncomfortable? Because their academic success threatens your singular view of the world? Vance stood up abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor. I am a tenured professor. I have taught for 20 years. You cannot allow a disgruntled student and a hired gun to dismantle my life's work based on out-of-context snippets. Sit down, Professor, Judge Reynolds commanded, her voice sharp as glass. The committee will determine the weight of this evidence. Counselor, call your next witness. Marcus turned to the defense table, his eyes meeting Maya's. The defense calls Miss Maya Caldwell to the stand. Maya rose, her movements unhurried, composed. As she walked to the witness chair, the room felt as though it were holding its breath. She sat down, her posture perfect, refusing to be diminished. She looked at Vance not with hatred, but with a terrifying clarity that finally forced the professor to look away.